everybody. Welcome to the Covert Report with Susan Lindauer. We're going to have a great show today. We're going to have Stewart Nicol on. He's a journalist from Scotland, and we are trying to reach him. He was there with me, and there we go. And he is, there we go. And he, we had to disconnect from him for a second, and he is having some trouble recognizing that he's got to let me back on. He's got to get back in with me. He thinks he's still there with me. We're going to have a really great show today. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back to the Covert Report. I had to hang up the phone to get the host queue on, and you kept holding on, and then you tried to call me, and you can't call me. I have to call you. Okay, great. Now we're all on. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to talk about today, everybody, an old terrorist case, the bombing of Pan Am 103, hence otherwise known as Lockerbie. And this was a bombing that happened in 1988. It is famous for being the justification for Libya's sanctions by the United States and the United Nations. The problem was, of course, that Libya had nothing to do with the attack. But the United Nations demanded, nevertheless, that Libya would have to turn over two of its citizens, which Gaddafi refused to do. Gaddafi was powerfully defensive and protective of his people, and he correctly recognized that because they were innocent, they had nothing to do with the crime at all, that it was preposterous to demand that they should be forced to be surrendered for trial. And as it happens, the task fell on yours truly, Susan Lindauer, your host, your very own host, to persuade Libya to do this. And a lot of the Scottish people and the American families hate it because they desperately wanted to keep up the lie of Libya's of Libya's guilt. And they were even to this day, the American families hate me. And the Scottish families, truly, Stewart, have never given me a thank you. They've never thanked me for getting the trial for them. They're very, I have it is a warning. It is a cautionary tale to all terrorist victims who want people to help them. You should really appreciate those of us who actually do it, because honest to God, you guys are a pain in the ass. And you don't have the information you think you have, and you become emotionally connected to this is what happened with Lockerbie. The families became emotionally connected to one scenario, and then they became impossible to convince of anything else. And so I want to start this off by stating, from the very beginning, from my very first meeting with the Libyans, I said to them, we know you are innocent. We know you did not do this crime. And the Libyans were amazed. I said, the problem is the families at that point, this was 1995. On both sides of the pond, both sides of the ocean, in the U.S. and Scotland, are so committed to this scenario of your guilt that we have to show them through a trial. We have to present the evidence to them. They've got to see that it just doesn't make sense. There is no connections that have to take place for the evidence to be real. And until they can see it and confront it and know it, they will continue to hold on to this mythology, this self-delusion. And I will tell you, too, now that enough time has passed, and now that they've had the trial, and now that the poor man, unfortunately, was convicted, we'll come back to that. That they were greedy. Libya had money. Libya had deep pockets, and unfortunately, the other people who were involved, the real people who were involved, had nothing. So they looked at, well, we could have a Libyan do this, and then we could get a whole bunch of cash out of it. Or we could go to the real people who did it, and they can't give us any money. So, gosh, isn't this terrible? We need compensation. So we'd rather have the compensation than the truth. And for those, and the Scottish families were not as bad as the American families. A couple of them, I believe, did not want any money, but he wanted truth. I respect him. I respect Jim Swire for that, but I don't respect the rest of these families. Greed plays a lot of factors. You see it again and again. That in terrorism cases, it's all driven. A lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is driven by money. Cui bono works in both directions. Who's going to benefit on the policy side, and who's going to profit? And when it comes to the blame game, who's going to profit from the receiving end of the victim side? And if there's a choice, Libya the Lockerbie trial is a devastating reminder that where there's a choice between truth and cold hard cash, guess which side is going to win out? The cold hard cash. So let's start it with that. And if anyone is picking up from, I know that they'll listen to this broadcast later on, and they should be a little bit ashamed. They should be a little bit ashamed that they jumped on this, because we told them over and over and over again, Libya did not do it. Megrahi was innocent. So the upshot of it was that, unfortunately, to give you more about historical background before we bring in Stewart, Libya was convicted. In 19, I broached contact with the Libyans in May of 95. Spent 6 months getting to know them before we could even do anything, and then by 96, we were starting to have discussions on a whole range of issues regarding terrorism. Libya was also a state sponsor of terror, was giving sanctuary. They were accused of state sponsoring terrorism. Really what they were doing was they were giving sanctuary to terrorists. And they weren't paying for them exactly. They weren't financing their operations, but they were giving them a safe zone, a safety zone to come down from afterwards. That was the real problem with Libya that we had to clean up. And we spent 96 and 97 doing that. And that was meaningful, because we had to, if we were going to get rid of the sanctions, there had to be a trial, and there had to be a cleanup of Libya's actions. And the cleanup was more important than the trial, to be perfectly honest with you. That had an impact. By 98, Libya was ready to really do the talks. And I know that because I had approximately 170 meetings with Libyan diplomats in all. And they finally got serious about it in about late 97, 98, when they started to see that they could move forward in the world, and they could rejoin the community of nations. They could get rid of the troublemakers, and they weren't going to get bit. And this is a tragedy. I'm really hitting you guys on this because Libya, one of the things that I had to overcome was that Libya was doing the direct talks with the Libyan embassy, was that Libya was very, very frightened, paranoid, hostile, socially alienated, and isolated. Really terribly isolated. They were completely alone in the world. They had no friends. And until we got involved with Hosni Mubarak, I insisted and again, yours truly did it. I blackmailed Hosni Mubarak, actually, into being friends with Libya, and forced the Egyptian embassy to do it. And they were at first they were reluctant, but then they saw that Libya heaped Egypt with wealth. Gaddafi was so grateful. Gaddafi poured financial resources into Egypt for the development of resort communities and building hotels, construction projects, and put a lot of people to work, which is the best cure for terrorism, is jobs. Give these young men a future and an ability to feed their families and build up a society, and they will gladly embrace it and they'll choose it every time. If they can have a good a decent income, not even a big income, but just jobs, a good income, build some skills. They want to get married because they can't have sex until they're married. Theoretically, their women are off limits until they're married. So they've got some problems on that front. They've got to have a family. And a whole bunch of frustrations, are solved if you give them a job. And that's what Gaddafi did. Gaddafi was so smart. He was a canny politician. He was ferociously devoted to the Libyan people. I just have to take this moment to tell you that. He was ferociously committed to protecting his people. He didn't fall down and forswear their interests. He never forsake them. He every Libyan alive should be grateful. All the Arab people should hold Gaddafi in the highest regard, because he would never sell anybody out for the West. He wouldn't do it. He just would not do it. And so it took longer to get them out, to get the trial. But I want everyone to know, in fact, we finally arranged the handover in March of 1999, and 2 men were taken, were delivered, handed over. Those were a man named Mr. FEMA and Mr. Abdelbasset Megrahi. And the trial started in the year 2000. And immediately, as we had predicted, the evidence showed that there was no evidence. And the trial dragged on and on with great gaps in time, because the prosecution had to, when they would present something, there'd be great drama build up and then nothing. And it was like, this is all you've got? Wow. These years of sanctions and you don't have any evidence? Whoa. And then they'd say, Your Honor, we need a recess so we can try to find more evidence. And then there'd be a recess for 3 or 4 months while they tried to find more evidence. So we're going to talk about this. They ended up, Mr. FEMA, the Scottish courts essentially split the baby down the middle. The Scottish courts said, okay, we'll let one of them go home, because there was no evidence to support this, no evidence to support a conviction. But they had a political investment in the outcome. So they let one of them go home and said, okay, you didn't do it. You FEMA did not do this. But Megrahi, you have got to be guilty. And they convicted him. And he served time in prison until he received a compassionate release for, I think it was prostate cancer. And now we're going to bring in my guest, Stewart Nicol. And Stewart is I had to give you that background. Stewart Nicol is a Scottish journalist. And how are you doing this morning, babe? Or this evening? It's evening where you are.
Well, it's sort of late afternoon, Susan. Good to hear you. I'm doing fine. The latest news in Scotland is quite interesting. Today, a headline in one of the Sunday papers is Jet Blast Case Against Megrahi Botched.
What is that, Jet Blast?
Jet Blast Case was botched against Megrahi. A police probe is looking into the Lockerbie case, and they believe it will back suspicions of false evidence against Abdel-Basset Al-Megrahi. That is totally new for that line to come out publicly. So that's the latest this morning on it.
Yeah, tell us more about the article. That's remarkable.
It's an article that's in the Sunday Sun, Scottish Sunday Sun, the Scottish edition, and it's a front page headline. And it's basically reporting a police investigation that's been going on for a while.
Tell us about the police. And sorry, I need you to give us the background on the police investigation as well.
Well, in recent years, there's been a number of requests, and the police have constantly been saying that they were still investigating the Lockerbie case. And also because the SCCRC, the appeal which began and then was stopped when Megrahi went home under compassionate leave, that appeal was beginning to show that the evidence was flawed. So the police then started looking at the case again. And what I believe is there is a general police investigation into the bombing, which is now looking at where the evidence should have been and what evidence was used at the trial. And it sounds like from what this headline says, they believe the investigation will back suspicions that false evidence was used to convict Libyan Abdel-Basset Al-Megrahi of the atrocity at the trial, which ended in 2001. Now, the interesting thing about this showing up that the evidence was wrong is interesting because back when the trial was on, I was investigating Lockerbie for a beginning, my investigation, which has lasted for the last 10 years plus. And I'm now working on my book on it. But that investigation has been ongoing. So that's interesting that we're now hearing in the media, because I've written umpteen stories which have never been used, pointing out this kind of thing. That shows there's a beginning to be a sea change. And of course, the families in Britain, they have always believed in the innocence of Megrahi.
They have not always believed in the innocence of Megrahi. They've been persuaded to.
Not before the trial, but after the trial, I think Jim Swire especially has clearly been the one that said the whole thing was wrong.
See, that was what we were hoping would happen. That was the whole, this is the tragedy. I want to be on record as saying for anyone in Scotland who listens to this, that was the purpose of the trial. And that was the purpose of the handover that we were arguing for with Libya from the very first days of the negotiations in 1995. From the very first meeting in May of 1995, I know this because I'm the one who did it.
Yeah.
And I told them, I said, we know that you're innocent. And the only way that we're going to prove you're innocent is to show the families are so attached to this lie. We have to show the families that there is no evidence to support your guilt. There is nothing here. And until they see it and they recognize it, they're confronted with it, that they're so emotionally connected to the story about your guilt. And I'll tell you, the families in America are greedy. It is money. Libya was forced to pay $10 million for each person who died. And given an apology, and they did not do it. And I visited some of these families at their homes, and they live like kings. They live in mansion, and it was all tax-free because in the United States, if you receive a judgment, or at least in this particular case, it's a special kind of legal judgment of cash rewards for damages, not like a civil dispute, but like in a crime. If you've suffered a crime and you receive compensation from the crime, that's all tax-free.
Yeah.
So everything they got from Pan Am Airlines, from Libya, it was all tax-free. And my friends, they live high on the hog. Beautiful artworks on the wall, mansions, big cars, lots of toys. They live very well. I mean, I can tell you, they made off like bandits in this thing. They're the den of 40 thieves. And if that sounds harsh, I'm going to tell you, anybody who's willing to throw an innocent man in prison because you're so greedy that you don't even care that he's innocent because you just want the money. I've lost any. If you don't respect your families, the family members who died, then I don't respect you.
Yeah.
Because you did not, the family members in the United States did not love the dead enough to get to the truth.
Yeah.
They allowed the lie. They wanted the lie. They protected the lie.
Yeah. The interesting thing is I've spoken to a number of the different families here in the UK, and Jim Swire's been their sort of spokesperson publicly over the years, and they have always been, since the trial, not convinced of Megrahi's guilt. And in fact, Jim Swire and the families in Britain, they were very disappointed that the families in America wouldn't back them, but they have asked the SCCRC to reopen the appeal. Because what happened, if you remember, a while after he was convicted, every convicted prisoner is allowed to appeal their sentence. And if that doesn't work, because the appeal was kind of very poorly done, in fact, I spoke to one lawyer who said the appeal was... Megrahi's defense team was the worst defense team he'd ever seen in his life, because the way they couched the appeal was almost designed to fail. So a while after that, he could approach the SCCRC. Now, that's the Scottish Criminal Case Review Commission. That's a body which is independent of the legal world, but looks at cases of possible injustice. And Megrahi's team put together a 400-page report to the SCCRC. They took about 3 years, if not 4, to review this, but at the end of it, they came to the agreement that Megrahi's human rights had been denied and that, in fact, he should not have been proved guilty and that there should be a further appeal. Now, that appeal was established and met, the first section of it met for quite a number of weeks, and it was split into kind of 3 areas. And the first area, which I attended most days, looked at the identification of this, or the supposed identification of Megrahi in the first place in that Maltese shop. And in fact, what was quite fascinating of the evidence coming out at the appeal was that Gauci had been, who was, I found out later, paid millions of dollars by the CIA.
$4 million.
Yeah, and he identified Megrahi, but in court, he never actually ever said Megrahi was the person in the shop. He said he resembled the person in the shop, but I know.
Now I have to interrupt you. I have to interrupt you right there to give background to the people.
Yeah.
What you're saying, or I want you to do it. I want you to step back for a second and tell them the history of that identification, because first of all, the shopkeeper in Malta got the day wrong. He said that there was that the man had come in with an umbrella, and that he knew this because he was watching a football game, which is actually soccer. For those of you in America, that's soccer. A soccer game, a football game, and it just happened that on the day of that football game, there was not a cloud in the sky. Now, so that's one thing. He gets the date, the confusion over the date. The second thing, the second serious problem with the identification is that first the man identified a different individual altogether, and he was a known terrorist called Abu Talib. And can you tell us about the identity?
Right.
So the first person, so in fact, Megrahi was the second person that he identified after he was given a nudge and a push in the direction by MI5 and the CIA and the FBI saying, no, you don't want to identify Abu Talib. You want to identify this guy over here. Don't you think he looks like this guy over here? And so they kept, but the shopkeeper in Malta first identified a different man entirely who happens to be a famous terrorist who is connected to the case.
What was interesting about the identification, and I looked at that quite closely at one point.
Oh, sorry, Scott. We're going to break right now.
Okay.
We're going to break. This is the Covert Report with Susan Lindauer. Our music is playing so low I can't hear it very well to know that it's on. And we're gonna get that taken care of. This is Susan Lindauer with Stewart Nicol. We're talking about Lockerbie and the bombing of Pan Am 103, and I'm going to let my guests talk after the show. After the break. I've given all the background that we need, and I promise that. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Covert Report with Susan Lindauer. Now I promise I'm going to let my guests speak. I'm going to let my guests speak, but I had to interrupt. There's so much background on the Lockerbie case. Let's talk for a minute. Okay, let's continue talking about the appeals, and I just need you to put more background, because here, let me just tell you something about you. You need to realize this is an international audience. You're used to a Scottish audience that already knows everything, but I need you to provide context for an international audience that is not reading about this every day in the newspaper.
Okay, dokes.
Okay.
Right. To go back to the identification, one of the big areas in the appeal which the SCCRC demanded did look at the identification and the anomalies in that. And what was interesting to me, because I'd looked at it before several years earlier, and what interested me, like you said, Susan, that one of the first mugshots he actually identified was a mugshot of Mohammed Abu Talib. A number of weeks later, another Scottish policeman went to interview him, and he gave a description of the man in the shop. Now, what's quite interesting is that his first description was of a fairly tall Libyan who was probably around 50. Now, the interesting thing is, Megrahi at that time would have been in his mid-30s, because Megrahi is exactly the same age as me.
That's right.
And he would have been in his 30s. The other interesting thing which you mentioned was about the race.
And he had a different physical appearance. He's
Yes.
smaller. The shopkeeper described a tall man in his mid-50s, kind of a swarthy Arab complexion. Yeah. But they didn't know he was Libyan. They didn't say, "Oh, he's a Libyan." No, swarthy Arab complexion.
Yes,
is what they said. They did not say he was Libyan. They said he was a swarthy Arab complexion.
Yes, the interesting thing is he did use the term Libyan in later identifications, but I spoke to a Maltese contact, and the interesting thing about Malta was because a lot of Arabs who went to Malta came from Libya, they started quite often using the term Libyan to mean Arab. So that was another interesting juxtaposition of a title which didn't actually mean anything. And as you said, the interesting thing about the the umbrella for rain was that on the dates that he claimed Megrahi was in his shop, there was no rain. But those items aside, I interviewed a contact of mine in London who's very experienced in legal things, and he had looked into the Lockerbie case and was quite amazed that the identification which was used during the trial was so poor. And in fact, he said under English law, it would have been inadmissible because when he identified a photograph of Megrahi, a mugshot, I think he was only shown at less than the number you're supposed to look at for legal practices to identify somebody. And when he in fact identified Megrahi in the lineup when they came, when you'd been able to persuade Gaddafi to release them, when he looked at the lineup, 𝙍𝙬𝙪 picked Megrahi out. However, what
but that was after that was after 10 years of
yes.
This was
but
after the attack occurs in 1988, and in December 1988, and in 1989, 𝙍𝙬𝙪 picked out Mohammed Talb, and then after years of coaching and being shown the picture on television and pushing, well, gosh, what about this man here? What about this man here? We'll pay you $4 million if you're willing to testify about this man here. And he's like, okay, I'll take the money.
And the interesting thing is one of the things which would have made his identification in the lineup technically illegal was that 𝙍𝙬𝙪 had looked at a magazine article about Lockerbie the day before he did the ID, and the front page of that magazine he was looking at had a picture of Megrahi titled The Lockerbie Bomber. So that, again, he was looking, he was being primed, as it were, this is the guy you pick. But even in court, when he was asked to identify Megrahi, who was sitting in the dock with FEMA, he still only said that Megrahi resembled the man who visited his shop. But that
was 10 years later.
That was 10 years later.
That was 10 years later. So by that time, Megrahi, who was originally in his 30s, was now in his mid 40s, he was starting to get closer to the age.
Yes, to the age
he was
the guy
still
had
10 years off, but it was starting to get closer to the age of the man who had come into the shop.
Yeah.
And which would be a tragedy, except that this actually happened.
But to backtrack on details behind the scenes, what was interesting when the trial came to Camp Zeist, like you said earlier, it took months and months because the evidence that was being put forward was far from it being very watertight, and it had sort of a huge amount of gaps in it. And periodically, like you said, they kept asking for a gap to get more evidence. What interests me, and you may not have come across this, but I managed to find a contact who had a very close connection to the case indirectly, and it quite surprised me, was that Gaddafi himself was so angered and disappointed at the outcome of the trial, he had the defense team audited by an English QC, and found that their defense of him had been the poorest ever. And what surprised this chap, because he was involved in the audit, was that they didn't sack that group before the appeal. But in fact, the appeal was so close that may have been that time didn't allow for that. But he was quite shocked at how poor the investigation and the defense was of Megrahi in the first place. But
they didn't put on any witnesses.
They never put anybody really to that.
No, they did not put on any witnesses. The prosecution had a year to present its case, and then the defense wasn't allowed to put on any witnesses. It was appalling.
Oh, it was so headed up the wrong way. Did you ever come across Mike Scharf?
No, I don't want to go off on details right now on like, insider stuff between you and I. Let's
No,
focus on the trial. Okay. Let's
but
focus on the appeals right now.
right.
Okay,
To come
please.
back to the appeal, what happened with that? The SCCRC had insisted that Megrahi hadn't got a fair shake on the trial, so there should be a new appeal. Now, a new appeal under Scots law is just like a defence of the actual case that had been held against Megrahi. And it was going to be split into 3 sections, I think, originally. And I attended all the first section. Now, what happened was the second and third part of it never got off the ground because Megrahi was released under compassionate grounds.
Now
At the end
let's
of,
again. I want you to back up and tell them
yeah.
how this builds up, because this is a very interesting. Okay, keep
What,
going. He
right.
was released on compassionate grounds. Tell them the build up to this.
Well, the build up to that, the appeal was ongoing, and it was held in front of 3 different judges who had nothing to do with the previous case. So they had to be totally separate from that. And the actual Lord Chief Justice was the head judge, who was excellent. I watched him, and he gave the Crown Office a hard time when they didn't produce things they were supposed to. And the appeal was looking at, they had to stick to what they call legal grounds. And one of the legal grounds that could clear Megrahi was obviously the identification being not just poor, but very bad. And the other thing was the fact that the guy had got paid millions of dollars, which under Scots law is inadmissible. So as the appeal rolled on, Megrahi's defence person was a lady called Maggie Scott, a very able QC, who gave the Crown Office a very hard time on their evidence, or rather lack of it. And at the end of the first section, there was due to be what they call an interim judgment. And I was quite interested that about a week before that section ended, we began to hear rumours that Megrahi was going to be released under compassionate leave, which in Scotland is a move that can happen when the government, if somebody is very ill, like he was facing death, you could allow the person to get home. But there was a lot of confusion in Scotland at the time because Tony Blair had concluded a deal with Gaddafi about allowing prisoners back to their country to, as it were, serve the rest of their time. And the American families were furious, of course, when he was released back to Libya, because, of course, he was fitted like a VIP by Gaddafi.
Which he was. An innocent man going free. Exactly. That's always something to celebrate.
And that was a celebration, and I was glad to see the Scots saltire was being waved at Tripoli Airport that day. And basically, I began to think this release of him under compassionate grounds is really a clever move, because it stopped the trial in its tracks, but it also meant that the judgment, which should have been written up and publicly put out, the end of that first section was no longer put out.
Now let's explain this to people, because in fact, during this whole period, now he was Megrahi. Let me give people the time frame. The terrorist attack, the bombing of Pan Am 103, happens in 1988. I make contact with Libya in May of 95. We do other things. the Libyans are like, no way are we going to. Gaddafi is so ferociously protective of his people. He refused to even consider the trial until 98, but we dealt with other issues, getting other terrorists out of the country. But he knew his people were innocent. We told him over and over again, the whole pretext of the negotiations are that the trial will show the families that there is no evidence to support a guilty conviction. And then one of them goes home. The handover occurs in March 99. In 2000, there is a trial. At the end of January or February of 2001, there is a guilty conviction for Megrahi, but FEMA goes free. And then Megrahi's appeal lasts, 15 years? From 2001, how long was he in prison? What year was he released?
Well, he was released.
The summer. What year was he released?
It must have been around 2009 that 2009. He was released.
So he's in thereabouts. So he is in prison from March of 99 until July of. He's in prison for approximately 10 years. From March of 99 until he's convicted in February of 2001, and in 2009. So for 8 years, there's this appeal going on. Now, I will tell you that behind the scenes, because I know this for a fact, behind the scenes, Gaddafi was spending money like crazy, hiring investigators to go after the bullshit story put out by this trial in the CIA. He did demand an audit, like Stewart said, an audit of the Queen's Counsel defense that was provided to FEMA versus Megrahi. And FEMA had a great team led by 𝙬𝙤𝙪𝙾𝙐𝙐, who actually was going to testify at my trial if I had ever gone to trial. 𝙬𝙤𝙪𝙾𝙐𝙐 is such an honorable gentleman and a ferocious litigator, a ferocious barrister, that he really backed he was tough. He was tough, and that's why FEMA got off. But Megrahi had a different attorney, and that different attorney did a very poor job, unfortunately. And Gaddafi had spent a huge amount of millions of dollars or pounds, millions of euros, fighting to get by, going around investigating and gathering evidence that would show Megrahi was innocent. And hello. Showing Megrahi was innocent. Woo! Yes, that's right.
Which alphabet soup?
That's the thunder in the background. Woo!
We've got fog here.
Good timing. But that's the point, was that that they had reached a point after 9 years. He'd been in prison for 10 years, from March of 99 until the summer of 2009. And then but for like 8 years, between February of 2001 and 2009, for 8 years, there had been this deep investigation by Gaddafi that had come up with all kinds of good stuff on the break-in at Frankfurt Airport, and another break-in at London Heathrow Airport, and some stuff that would have been really, really juicy. Facts about heroin trafficking, out of the Bekaa Valley, and CIA connections to heroin trafficking, and what were they hiding, and what were they doing, what was the money, what was who really is guilty here. And Gaddafi had a lot of juice, had a lot of good stuff. And Britain, when they were confronted with this stuff, they were like, if we have to release this to the public, if this appeal doesn't stop, if this appeal goes forward, all of this devastating information is going to go out to the Lockerbie families. And the U.S. families were like, no, don't let them tell that we lied. Don't let them expose that they know very well they didn't do it. Don't tell anybody. Don't let this happen. You have to protect us. Protect us. Poo on you. And the Scottish families were like, we want to know who did this. The Scottish families really now, by this point, there's a divergence between the Scottish families and the American families. The Scottish families are like, give us the truth. We want the truth. And the American families are like, don't tell anybody we're taking their money for a lie. We want more money. We want more money. We're greedy. I hate the American families. I really do. I despise them. But I do feel for the Scottish families, and I respect them for wanting the truth. But all of this, you see, had been gathered by Gaddafi in the appeal. And the deal was, so when they offered the release, they agreed to hide, to conceal, to bury the evidence in the appeal. And this is a very important fact, isn't it?
Yeah, that's one of the key things which I think in the when the SCCRC were looking at when Megrahi went to them to get an appeal, they had to furnish a lot of material, and I know they furnished over 400 pages, and including inside people who were in the police, who were very unhappy at what did take place, because a lot of material was removed from Lockerbie in the first 48 hours, and for a wide range of reasons. But I know an MP who had a constituent who was a policeman on duty there the first night, and he actually complained to his MP about the interference that was going on in what was a crime scene. And so the interesting thing about the SCCRC is that when they were looking at all this evidence, I think they must have been pressurized from either American or British government, or British government by pressure being put on them from America, because when the SCCRC did demand the appeal, they were very careful to try and say that a lot of the intelligence stuff wasn't valid. It shouldn't be brought into the trial.
Oh,
which is
it's
very
too sensitive. It'll be embarrassing.
So I think they knew very quickly that if all that appeared, they were going to be in big trouble. But the interesting thing is that the appeal started and reached the end of the first phase. But as I say, unfortunately, because of him being released, but there was an interesting confusion here because Blair had made an agreement with Gaddafi for prisoners being allowed back to their country to serve sentences. The interesting thing was, when Blair made that agreement with Gaddafi, there was only one Libyan prisoner in the whole of the United Kingdom, and that was Abdelbasset Al-Megrahi. And the interesting thing was, the agreement was that if the person was to be released and go back to his own country, he could not have an appeal continue. And I think poor Abdelbasset was so ill at the time that he was perhaps confused to the fact that he could have allowed the appeal to continue. And this is why the families...
No, he couldn't. The whole reason that they let him go was because he agreed to drop the appeal.
Yes, he agreed to drop.
The only reason was that they did not want you, the Scottish people, ever to get all the information that Gaddafi had amassed, because it went beyond. I mean, I'll tell you honestly, because I know what was going on during this period. I know what was happening in that intervening 8 years, and they were getting a lot of information about who else had been responsible and the other interested parties, and the history of the heroin trafficking and the other break-ins. There was there's talk of a break-in at Heathrow overthrow and a break-in at Frankfurt, and it was like like a double team checking to make sure things hadn't gone, that the wrong suitcase hadn't gotten out, or taking out a different suitcase. They took out the heroin at Frankfurt, and then they took out the other suitcase. See, this is what I've always thought, was that there were 2 or 3 suitcases, because always what the Pan Am flights, now in reality, Pan Am Airlines was being used as a transit for heroin out of Syria, Lebanon, and it was being ushered through by the CIA. So one suitcase, this is a fact, people, don't get upset, listen, this is a fact. One suitcase was always getting off in Frankfurt, and one suitcase was always getting off in London. Okay, and then another suitcase, a third suitcase, people, was going to New York. And so they'd drop off it. They'd have a drop in Frankfurt, a drop in London, and a drop in New York. So they had to make sure they got the right suitcases in Frankfurt and London. And they had to make sure that they weren't taking off the wrong suitcase, which had the bomb. So they actually had to go in and make sure that they got the right one. You see what I'm saying? They could not risk taking the wrong suitcase off the airplane. See, this is the sad part of this whole thing. So, it's so diabolical. But anyway, the reason for the appeal, that dropping the appeal, that at the same time that Megrahi is released, he is required. It's not a choice he has. It is the condition. It is the precondition.
It was an automatic switch that was put onto it.
Yeah,
which
he did
I
not
know
have a choice, because it would be nice for the families to know the truth.
Well, the families want to know the truth, you see.
And in fact, that was a choice that was made.
Yeah, and the families still want the truth out, because they want although he's died, they want their father's name clear, because it's important to them. And this is the different thing about the SCCRC. The families of the Megrahi family and the British families, have put this petition to the SCCRC. Now, my guess is it'll probably take months, if not a couple of years, to sort of fiddle about with this. That's the trouble. However, having seen that headline today, I'm hopeful that things are beginning to percolate through that may see a real investigation take place. And because of this politics in Scotland, we had a referendum recently to be independent of UK, and that was quite narrowly won by the people who want to stay in the UK. And I think that's influenced it.
Everybody, we're about to go to break. This is Susan Ladauer with my guest Stewart Nicol. We're talking about Lockerbie and M23 and the injustice unto
This is Truth Frequency Radio.
The wicked ones, obviously under heavy Masonic influence.
everybody. Welcome back to the Covert Report with Susan Lindauer. My guest today, Stewart Nicol. And Stewart, I have to apologize to you. I know so much about this myself that I keep interrupting you. Let's focus let's continue talking about the appeal and the evidence, because this is just so devastating. And right before the break, I was doing all the talking about how the appeal was the release of Megrahi's release on compassionate grounds because of his prostate, his stage 4 prostate cancer, with a death sentence attached to it, was the justification used to get him out. However, many inmates have died in prison, people. And when you have a life sentence, you are expected to die in prison. They don't give a damn about you dying in prison, I can assure you. This was different because they were afraid of this information. If the appeal had gone forward, all of this classified. See, it was classified on the U.S. side, but if Gaddafi got it on his own, which he did, he spent a fortune getting evidence, in hiring investigators and putting together this stuff. And he did a remarkable job, and it would have just blown, the Scottish and United Nations, international courts system concept out of the water. It just would have shamed the British so badly that they had lied about Lockerbie so badly. They had to kill it. And so he said, well, you let him go and we'll kill the appeal. And that was it.
Coming to the appeal again, one interesting thing was that during the appeal, one of the American lawyers who worked for the State Department, who actually was involved in writing the indictments against Megrahi and FEMA, turned up at the court. And it was very interesting to watch him because he was clearly uncomfortable about some of the identification information being questioned so harshly. And I met him in the corridor briefly, and I just sort of found out who he was. And I said, why are you here? He says, to keep things on track. So I knew fine that he was obviously going to be reporting back to powers that be in the stateside. Yes. That this appeal was very much not going the way they expected. You see, Scots law is very rigorous. And the interesting thing is that most people I spoke to after the end of the first trial were quite surprised at the verdict. That FEMA was released, and the other one was said to be guilty, because the charge on the sheet was actually a conspiracy to murder as well as the murders. And that was an interesting point, that towards the end of the trial, the
evidence was the same against both of them. The evidence was the same against both of them. Yeah. So if one was innocent, why was the other one guilty?
Exactly.
And that was, I remember I wept for the injustice to Megrahi, not because of his, the poor families. No, shame on you. Shame on all of you. Yeah. I mean, they really should be ashamed that they have persecuted this man and refused to see justice. I cannot tell you how many times, and I get so angry at all of you, not at you, Stewart, but at a lot of the families who say, oh, tell us the truth. And then we tell them the truth. And then they're like, oh, gosh, it'll take us so long to process this. It'll be so, oh, gosh, what about Megrahi? Megrahi had nothing to do with this. Never. He was completely innocent, and we knew it. And if you guys had the justice system you think you have, you would already have the truth, because we would have given it to you. We were hoping that now listen, we expected in February of 2001 that the Scottish justice system would have the rigorous scrutiny of evidence to see that it was garbage, and they would say, you know what, these guys, neither one of them did it, both of them are acquitted. And then the Scottish families would say, well, if they didn't do it, who did? And I'm going to tell you right now, we were ready to jump in and give it to you. There was a fight in the intelligence community in the United States, and you would have had this truth already. So you only have yourselves to blame that you didn't get it because you just couldn't, you had to save face. You were so ashamed. Your Justice Department was so, your judges were so weak.
Well,
they were more interested in saving face than and not shaming the justice system, because they'd already imposed these sanctions on Libya, and they were more committed to the sanctions than they were to the families.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the judicial system is the power of the Crown Office. And because most of the Crown Office people, anybody who's on the bench who are judges, will have gone through the Crown Office at some stage. And I think there was certainly pressure put on judges. I know from very good sources that judges on the first trial, at the end of the first trial, I know that they were supposed to find both guilty, but in fact, I know one judge who would not agree to that, and the only way they could get an agreement was that FEMA was released, or one of them was released, and it happened to be FEMA. And Megrahi was the fall guy. And I know from good sources that there must have been pressure put on some of the judges from Crown Office side as well as from the intelligence side here, because it's interesting that my phone was tapped by MI5 and 6 when I was investigating it and finding the truth. And Jim Swire also, his phone was tapped by the intelligence services periodically when he was trying to find out what was really happening. So it seems a strange case when you've got intelligence services of your country and of other countries trying to find out what you're doing instead of trying to find out who the real terrorists were. You mentioned Abu Talib. I don't know if you heard that Jim Swire actually tried to go to Sweden recently and confront him, but he wouldn't meet him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he flew to Stockholm to see Talib, saw Talib's son, but Talib was just a coward. He wouldn't meet him.
Well, I'm going to tell you something, that this is going to hurt the families. But the Arabs have seen, and this is actually pretty serious. And this is going to make the families so angry, because they're like, our families died. We have the right to truth. But you didn't give a damn about truth for years. You kept insisting. It took you so long. We kept telling you they didn't do it. Everybody told you that, you kept hearing it. Les Coleman told you the truth about Lockerbie in the Trail of the Octopus. And he was prosecuted and sent to prison. And, Jim Swire, and, I love Robert Black. Professor Robert Black, wonderful men, but you have been told the truth. You want to know who did it? Buy the book Trail of the Octopus, and know that poor man, Les Coleman, was hunted down and sent to prison for publishing it. So I mean, it's just like they've been told the truth again and again and again. People have suffered to give you the truth. And then you're like, oh gosh,
But you see, I think
it's going to take us so long to understand this, and it's going to take us so long to process it. Could you just tell us again? Oh, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we do know. We do know.
See, I think one of the problems is that if you look at the number of articles over the years, and I've done 2 documentaries on Lockerbie, and all of them have pointed to what really happened. And the interesting thing is, a lot of the public out there are questioning it. But the problem about the Crown Office, the police, have orchestrated silence by fair means and foul. There was a case of an inspector who was tried for perjury because she would not lie about a fingerprint in a case she was looking at. And in fact, the reason that she was attacked viciously by the police was because the guy who was in charge of the fingerprint bureau was the second clear witness in Lockerbie. And the FBI and CIA clearly did not want any stain connected to this chap before he appeared at the trial. And they literally crucified this girl. And at the end of the day, it took her about 4 or 5 years. She eventually was exonerated. But I remember meeting her dad and said, look, this thing's connected to Lockerbie case. And I told him what I had suspected. And his first reaction was, Stewart, you're nuts. However, good few years later, he invited me to a book launch that he'd written about the case of defending his daughter. And he said, I owe you an apology. You were 100% right. Because it was a way of trying to protect the powers that be. I remember a QC I met just when I first started investigating Lockerbie, and his reaction was,
QC is
your brother?
Sorry, QC
Queen's
is
Counsel,
Queen's Counsel.
Queen's Counsel, which is the kind of highest level of defence and prosecuting lawyers in Scotland and England. But they're both different systems, so they don't always practice on both. And this QC said to me, why are you bothering? 5 judges can't be wrong. My retort to that was, are they human? His reply had to be yes. And if they're human, then they can make mistakes.
Absolutely.
So years later I met him, and the interesting thing was, he said, are you still following that one? I said, yes, I'm getting closer. And I said, eventually, people will realize this chap was very badly done by, and he was totally innocent, nothing to do with it. And
yeah, I feel sorry for Megrahi. I really do.
Yeah.
He's the only one I feel sorry for. Everybody else, Les Coleman, you want to know what happened? Read the book Trail of the Octopus by Lester Coleman.
That was one of the first ones I read back in 98. And that's what put me on to some of the clues and the people I needed to interview to discover what was really going on. It was an excellent book, and again, that book was pulped. The CIA had Coleman thrown in jail eventually for some trumped-up charge, and the book publishers had to recall most of the copies.
They pulped them. They shredded the books.
They pulped them and shredded them, but interestingly enough, I got my copy at a church sale of work in Edinburgh. So it must have been one of the early copies put out for, pre-advertising to a bookshop or something, and the bookshop must have given it to the church. But I got that, and then I discovered most of the copies had been pulped. But that book gave you a lot of insight into what was going on.
It tells the whole story. It lays out the whole conspiracy.
Yes.
This happened for a reason. The real reason Lockerbie happened, and I'm going to go interrupt you again.
That's okay.
Trail of the Octopus. If you want to know what happened, Les Coleman tells it all in graphic detail. The CIA had, and I learned about this. I learned about it from another end in 1996. Les Coleman was still getting his book together and everything. I was a press secretary for Senator Carol Moseley Braun, and I went to lunch one day, and a man came and stopped me in front of the United States Supreme Court building, which I think is sort of appropriate because it was such a miscarriage of justice. And he said, I want to take you to lunch. He said, you're really scaring a lot of people. And I said, oh, am I? I said, I'm a real troublemaker. He said, yes, you are. You're making some very dangerous enemies. And I thought I should explain to you why, because I don't think you really know what you're doing here. And it's about Libya. And he says to me, you're making some very powerful enemies. And he told me from the CIA's perspective, he said that during the hostage crisis, they considered it was necessary to infiltrate heroin trafficking. They put their spin on it, that they were doing something good. That was the only way that they could find the hostages was to connect in with the heroin trafficking. They said that they did not support it or encourage it, but that they had no other way. But that a rogue agent not part of the rogue agent, violated the trust of the bigger team. And this was their story. This was their spin on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that the rogue agent had been tipping off the bad guys who were holding the hostages. And they called in, and so Dennis McKee from the Defense Intelligence Agency called in. Langley called the FBI and said, we're protesting this. Every time we get close to finding the hostages, one of these agents, one of the CIA team, is notifying the hostage takers, the hostage takers, and they're moving the hostages again. We're going to huge amounts of trouble to find these guys. And there's a rotten apple on the CIA side. So Langley, the CIA in Langley headquarters, sent out a team with the FBI, and they went and they interviewed a whole bunch of people. They did a huge investigative investigation, and came back with heroin and money. And they brought the deputy station chief back from, I believe it was the deputy station chief and a couple of others, and they were all flying back on, you guessed it, Pan Am 103, Pan Am 103, and they were all coming back to explain to Washington and really to face criminal prosecution. But the Defense Intelligence team that had exposed the heroin trafficking was on the plane as well. So the FBI team that's just done the investigation and the Defense Intelligence team, which is complaining about the heroin trafficking, and the guilty people at the CIA are all on that plane, the same plane. They're all flying back. And Hezbollah, or the Islamic Jihad group that had been holding the hostages, was apparently tipped off that the plane that these investigators were going back to Washington, and they were told to switch one of the suitcases. And again, I am telling you, there is more than one suitcase.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there is a heroin suitcase for Frankfurt. There is a heroin suitcase for London, and there is a heroin suitcase for New York. And so the reason for the break-ins in the luggage compartments in Frankfurt and London is to make sure that they get rid of all that they have as it's clearing customs and moving through, because it had been going through like a weird process. They had to make sure they got the right suitcases off the planes. In case they didn't want any heroin on those suitcases, and they didn't want any heroin suitcases on that airplane when it came down, because that would validate the complaints.
Yeah.
So that's why they have the break-ins at the airports. It really is that simple.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
it's that simple.
The interesting thing about the suitcases, Susan, is that the Crown Office constantly denied any likelihood of a drug suitcase on the scene, in the wreckage, and yet I know, because I've seen a photograph of it, and I know the farmer whose land it was on, he was concerned for his animals perhaps getting to the stuff, and he pointed it out to the police, and that suitcase was taken away by CIA, and it was never mentioned on the evidence tags, because all the baggage should have been marked and listed. And when I asked Crown Office on several occasions about whether there was a drugs case, they said no drugs were found, because they knew also that would have destroyed the case against Megrahi, because what they were trying to say is that Megrahi switched a drug case in Malta for this bomb. But the other interesting thing is about the actual... But
there's more than one suitcase.
Exactly. But the thing was, they didn't want any mention of suitcase anyway, because they were so afraid that would destroy their story. And the break-ins, when the appeal came on, the break-in at Heathrow, the Crown Office constantly sort of said, well, this is not really valid or connected to this case. And they just kept arguing that it wasn't important. And then I think if the new appeal had been continued, that would have been another area where they would have brought huge amount of evidence to book. But it's interesting that you mentioned 𝙎𝙚𝙦𝙫𝙐, who was the CIA guy who was in Lebanon.
Defense intelligence.
Yeah, DIA. He actually went back on Panam 103 a day earlier than was planned, which is quite interesting.
No, he didn't. No, he did. No. Oh, okay. Well,
he did, because I checked with his
Dennis McKee died.
People.
Dennis McKee died
He died in 103, but he was due to travel the next day. But in fact, he traveled the day early, and his travel plans were informed to various sections, despite the fact that he tried to keep that fairly quiet, because he was bringing back the evidence of that drugs thing with him.
So he had to travel with the FBI so that the FBI, otherwise if you're traveling alone without the FBI, so you're going to go down for that, baby.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The other interesting thing was I interviewed a military man who was on the scene the first 48 hours, who was a colonel in charge of the army unit helping the police that night, first night. And I asked him in an interview a few years later what he remembers most about the night. And he said, well, apart from the terrible tragedy and carnage, was that one of my squaddies must be the most honest man I've ever had under my command, because he brought him an attaché case. And he said, sir, I know I shouldn't have moved this from outside, but I'm really concerned that it shouldn't stay there, because inside is something like $1 million in cash.
Wow.
And he handed this case over to his colonel, who then handed it over to the police. And when I asked about that case and money, again, I was told there was no reference to it in the documents. Now, that was $1 million, because the colonel checked it to hand over and signed for it. And where did that go? I always ask myself.
So the heroin disappears, the money disappears.
The heroin disappeared.
But you can see how greatly they simplified this. They simplified it down to one suitcase, and they have and golly, 𝙬𝙤𝙫𝙬 works as an airplane. As for Libyan Airlines, and gosh, they just put that bomb on that suitcase right on that plane, and it originates in Malta, and it gets all the way through. That's how it gets through customs, and I mean, what a great patsy! What a great patsy!
Oh yeah, but this is one of the things they seem to constantly do. But what I still smile at is on the day of the verdict, where they convicted 𝙬𝙬𝙁. I filed a story from Zurich to a number of newspapers, including the Evening News of Edinburgh. And the only paper that printed my story was the Evening News of Edinburgh. And my story was basically forensic evidence has been manipulated, because I'd interviewed Bollier in Zurich that morning and about the timer that they claimed was his. And he pointed out that he had supplied timers to the Libyans, but that the timer he had been shown, the fragment of timer he'd been shown when he came to Scotland 10 years after the event, was the wrong colour. And he said this to the Crown Office, who then, their representative, went ballistic and insisted that he identify it. And I've still got in my files a copy of his statement he made, clearly pointing out that he was shown two different fragments, and that those fragments, although one could have been from his company, he was not 100% sure, but it was the wrong colour, because it wasn't the ones he sold to Libya, it was the ones he sold to the Stasi.
The ones, yes. So what happened was Bollier is shown a fragment of a bomb timer.
Supposedly.
And he says that's not the right one. So then the police come back. They said, "Here, is this the right one?" He said, "Well, yeah,
That's the right color.
That's the right color." and that
so...
was okay. Everybody, we're going to break. This is the Covert Report with Susan Lindauer. We have a caller after the break, and we will come right back and pick you up from Utah.
Like a cancer that's silently spreading.
Agent for Truth with Joe Bannister.
Sundays on Truth Frequency Radio.
He's got a star map of Hollywood, a list of cheap motels all along the freeway. She's got a sister out in Vegas, promise of a decent job, far away from her hometown. They travel on the road to redemption.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Covert Report with Susan Lindauer. I'm on today with Stewart Nicol, a Scottish journalist who is one of the foremost experts on Lockerbie, and I have to apologize to Stewart that I keep interrupting him because he has so much personal knowledge to contribute. Tell us about the book you're writing and fill us in on more of what's happening right now, because it seems like in the long run we're going to have the truth. We're going to have the truth.
Yeah. I think the truth is one thing you can hide for a while, but eventually it has a habit of coming out and being known. And once people see it, they wonder why on earth they missed it in the first place. But I've researched this for over 10 years, as you know. So I've got so much material, I decided I'd put it in a kind of book form. So basically, it is a complex case because there's so much geopolitics around it, and there's also so many things about aircraft that people don't know, that what I've decided is to put it in a book, and one section will be about the actual plane, another section will be about the sort of people involved and the victims, and the last section will look at who may well have been the real perpetrators of the dirty deed. And I'm still waiting for a publisher brave enough. Maybe there's an American publisher out there brave enough to contact me. If there is, then maybe contact your show and you could pass it on to me. But basically, it is a complex case, and I think that's another reason why the ordinary person who's not reading a great deal of detail just accept what comes out in the general media. And what's disappointed me over the media in Scotland, and it is a big disappointment, is that they have had umpteen indications that this was not a correct case, and yet very few have actually been brave enough to publish the material I've sent. Probably one of the best pieces was done along with another journalist who now works for the BBC, but he was in the Glasgow Herald at the time, Sunday Herald, and that was a piece where we showed the real flaws in the case, and it was published, quite to my surprise actually, but it was published and it did underline a lot of the flaws. And we had an interview with L Coleman that you mentioned earlier. So basically, I hope that I can get a brave enough publisher. I've put a few feelers out to publishers in Scotland, but I may end up publishing it through the Kindle system on Amazon, because it's quite an interesting way of
I strongly, I published my book through Amazon, and there's Amazon and Kindle. You can have both of them. And I strongly urge you to use Amazon as a publisher, because they have great, you are a man of great sourcing and great intelligence and great knowledge. You have a vast wealth of knowledge and a deep history, and Amazon would publish your book. But what do you have a title for it yet?
I have a title which is quite an interesting one, I think. It's not what you would expect. It's called Morning Light.
Morning Light.
Morning Light shows up the dirty deeds of people. But the Morning Light was the original name of that aircraft. Pan Am 103, which was known as the Clipper Made of the Seas when it was downed, it originally was one of the first 15 jumbo jets ever built. And its name was Morning Light up until the time Pan Am changed all their names of their aircraft to Clipper.
It was the Morning Light. That was the name of the airplane. I did not know that.
I got in touch with Boeing, who were very helpful in giving me the history of that aircraft's building and what its first name was.
Well, now, that's fascinating. Now, tell us more of what's the appeal. We talked about the identification, the wrongful identity. We have a caller from Utah, if you don't mind. But then also I want to, let's see if I can get, hello, caller. Let's see. Caller, are you there? Let's see. Nope. Let's see if we can get... Caller? Are you there? Hello, caller. Nope.
I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Hello, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes, I certainly can.
Okay. Caller, do you have a question for Stewart?
Well, it's not so much a question as my interrelationships with the senior federal district judge in Houston, Lynn Hughes, and the Oliver North Mafia that supplied the plastic explosives to Mr. Wilson that brought the plane down. You are aware of all those matters, correct?
Tell us about this. You're talking about the Lockerbie plane.
There's a very long trial in federal district court in Houston involving Mr. Wilson, where federal judge Hughes released him from jail because he knew that the CIA and FBI had set him up and that Wilson had full participation of Oliver North and the gang from Bill Casey and Admiral Poindexter's office in the Reagan administration to sell the C4 to Mr. Wilson. In other words, Wilson was acting with...
Are you talking about the Lockerbie case or something else?
I'm talking about the Lockerbie case, where the explosives came from that blew up the plane.
Stewart, do you know the story of Mr. Wilson?
Ed Wilson was an interesting character because he was set up by the CIA and put away for many years, and he was released because the case against him was found to be more than faulty.
Wasn't he already in prison when this Lockerbie case happened?
That's what I was thinking. The timing is
possibly. He was in jail. He was in jail for the explosives, but the explosives hadn't been used yet. The bottom line is if you track all of this money to Wilson and you go through the transcripts and read the book Trail of the Octopus, you'll begin to put together a picture of the Project for a New American Century, where they needed this false flag event to give justification to the Department of Defense to begin its operations in Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Afghanistan, and in Libya against Gaddafi. This whole thing is traceable to Mr. Oliver North's his shredding party in the basement of the White House. When North began shredding all the documents and all the financial records, it was to cover up the trail of money that was behind the providing of this massive amount of C4 to Gaddafi.
That was part of what they were doing. That's part of what they did. But they didn't provide it to Gaddafi. They provided it to somebody else. Because Gaddafi had nothing to do with Lockerbie.
Gaddafi was in the weapons transfer chain of custody. The trial of Charles Wilson in Lynn Hughes' court, I sat in the courtroom and listened to the whole story, at the very same time I was shutting down the Gulf Manor Airport owned by the bin Ladens next door to the Ellington Air Force Base in Houston, Texas. Long story short, Oliver North and the CIA's hands are dripping in blood.
Absolutely.
The Lockerbie plane was brought down with CIA explosives.
Yes.
End of story.
Yes, but let me just tell you that what you're saying actually is very interesting, because it's definitely CIA explosives, and what you're saying is that Ed Wilson provided it, but my correction is that he may not have provided that C4 to Libya. If it was his C4, then it was not provided to Libya. It was because this bomb for this airplane came from Syria and Lebanon. But that doesn't mean, because Ed Wilson and Oliver North are up to their eyeballs in the heroin trade, and that's where they, the oil for guns and the Iran Contra, that whole part is very much tied in to heroin trafficking as well, illegal arms and drugs. And so my correction is that Ed Wilson, the explosives that were used in this were not from Gaddafi. They were from Syria. But Ed Wilson may have given it to them. Ed Wilson may have given it that.
Long story short, you keep mixing up Ed Wilson and Charlie Wilson. Ed Wilson's one story. Joanna Herring King and Charles Wilson's secret arming of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan.
Okay,
that's
Charlie
connected
Wilson.
to Oliver North.
Okay.
This is what I'm telling you.
Okay, so are you talking about Ed Wilson or are you talking about Ed Wilson or Charlie Wilson?
I'm talking about the Ed Wilson trial in Judge Hughes' courts connected to Charlie Wilson, Joanna Herring King, and the Enterprises. Mr. Secord, North, Poindexter, Casey, and Reagan, the whole gang that utilized the Gulf Manor Airport next to the Ellington Air Force Base in Houston, owned by the bin Laden family. Wow. You see, everybody kind of tries to compartmentalize all these different, criminal acts. But what it boils down to is it was all being orchestrated from the basement of the White House by the NSA and Mr. North and the boys, the company. Oliver North's fingerprints are all over Lockerbie.
I agree with you, and Stewart, what he's saying, I don't know about the Ed Wilson angle. To be honest with you, sir, I have not heard that before. But the Ollie North thing is definitely on the money. They are the ones they're the dirty team. Ollie North is the dirty team in the heroin trafficking. That was, we all think of Iran Contra, and we think of that they were, like you just said, we compartmentalize, and we think of the bad guys as having the bad CIA as being connected to that. But they were all doing this. They were running a whole bunch of different operations at the same time, and one of them was to get money out of the heroin trafficking. Absolutely. But I have to tell you, it's very important to correct you on one thing. Ed Wilson was set up on the Libya thing. He did not. The C4 that was used in Lockerbie did not come through Gaddafi. It did not.
Long story short, I sat in the courtroom. Sat in the courtroom and watched.
But that was like a show trial. But that was a show trial too. They make up stories in court as well. And Ed Wilson got really screwed on Libya. But the C4, whatever C4 he did give them, let's just say he did give Gaddafi C4. That's not the same C4 that was used in this attack, because it's not, because the C4 in this attack came from Lebanon and Syria. But it was the same people.
Well, the Lebanese and Syrians got it from Gaddafi.
No, but
I sat in
Gaddafi had
the
nothing.
courtroom. I
But
watched the whole
Gaddafi had
thing.
nothing to do with it. But see, this is the thing that is the problem. The only problem with your story is, and otherwise your stories, otherwise what you're saying is dead on the money, because the
Susan, it's
Oliver.
not my story. It's what I witnessed in a federal court.
But federal
It's not
courts
my
lie all the
story.
time. Federal courts lie all the time. That's the problem. Federal courts.
Well, I watched the witnesses and I watched Mr. Wilson. I watched the whole thing, and the bottom line is this entire mess was orchestrated by Reagan Bush out of the basement of the NSA at the White House, and the explosives that brought down the Lockerbie flight came from the CIA.
Yes.
End of story.
Yes.
That's why Wilson was sprung from jail. That's why Judge Hughes released him.
He served, okay, I was under the impression that Ed Wilson served like 37 years in prison. He served.
I sat in the court, watched Judge Hughes come unglued on the CIA's lawyers.
Oh, okay.
I watched Hughes turn purple in the face and scream at him more than once.
But Ed Wilson served 37 years in prison.
Just because someone gets railroaded and set up and spends 37 years in prison makes no difference. He was released.
In 2003.
Because, you have any idea the unbelievable move of a senior federal judge to release a prisoner on a case of this nature because the CIA was caught numerous times lying about the authorizations that Mr. Wilson had.
I agree. And I was, well, listen, you I don't know if you're aware of my story. I got arrested on the Patriot Act as an accused Iraqi agent. And when I was released, I'll tell you a funny story. Ed Wilson's attorney came to my release. And it just so happened that there were two men sitting in the courtroom. One of them was my boyfriend, who had come to pick me up, and the other was the attorney for Ed Wilson. And he said to me, and I came out of the prison, I came out of the courtroom after my release from prison because my judge was Michael Mukasey, and he said he let me go on his last day on the bench. He set me free. And he set me free. And when I came out of the courtroom, just stunned, just absolutely just blown up, I had expected to go back to prison. I didn't know what they were going to do to me. It was a terrifying moment in my life. What was this decision going to be? And Ed Wilson's attorney was there waiting for me. And he said, "Susan, you have no idea how lucky you are today." He said, "You should get down on your knees and you should thank God that they took the boys at Langley took mercy on you, because boy, do they know how to play. If they wanted to tear you to pieces, you would have been torn to pieces. But they respected what you've done in the past." And because they know that this is, you've done so, they said, he said, this is our nudge to you, was that we got you out of this. He said, "You are never to mention that you were a CIA asset again." And I said, but, he said, "No." He said, "If you mention it, you're going right back. You tell anybody, you're going right back."
Susan, let me give you a little insight. The Bin Ladens and Jimmy Baker of Baker and Botts, and the law firm of Vinson and Elkins, and the law firm of Sewell and Riggs of Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., and North and Secord, and the first American corporation, James R. Bath, Roger Altman, and Clark Clifford of the First American Corporation. That's who was behind the banks of Commerce and Credit International. And it's First American Corporation, First American Title Insurance Corporation behind MERS, this vast, massive, enormous, gargantuan money operation that Oliver North was associated with. The reason it all came unglued, quite literally, is because North and Secord were operating out of the Galleria Hotel right down the block from the Houstonian Estates where George Bush was living. I built his residence at Houstonian Estates, and I was responsible for huge amounts of construction at the Galleria and at Transco Gas. I'm the guy that pinched North and Secord in Houston. And Charlie Wilson and Joanna Herring King and James Baker and the whole gang that were financing Iran-Contra and using the Gulf Manor Airport to be the actuary of the transactions.
Wow. And you're the one who pinched them.
Oh, you got this. Well,
I'd love to have
understand,
you.
I had no idea what I was walking into. I had no idea at all what I was walking into. But I can tell you right now, this second in America, how many trillions of dollars have come up missing in the real estate markets? Trillions. And now we've got HSBC and Union Bank of Scotland, UBS, that's Phil Graham from Conroe, Texas. You had Michael Atkinson, one of the biggest actuaries in the entire Iran-Contra matter. His brother and father were running a very large furniture store at Conroe, up north of the Woodlands, north of Houston. And then you had Roland Carnaby living in Willis. Bottom line is, Richard Secord, Oliver North, George Bush was directly in the loop. This crap, he didn't know what was going on. He's a lying sack of poop. And I walked into it because I got caught up in the middle of a bunch of real estate development and banking transactions with the RLG holdings of Zurich, Switzerland, the Westgate Investments that were directly involved with First American Corporation, First American Bank, First American Title Insurance. And Susan, you see, you're not the only one that's ever served in the CIA. You know who Bud McFarland is?
Yes.
You know who Robert Owens is?
I know some of these people. Yes.
I believe you. They have a camp on Assembly Point at Lake George, and Bud McFarland, I used to date his daughter in Glens Falls. Michael Atkinson and his family are personal friends of mine. You see, when I ran into it all, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I went absolutely ballistic in the Houston Post and in the Houston Chronicle with Peter Bruton. Peter Bruton's source of information is talking to you right now.
Well.
The Lockerbie flight was brought down with CIA explosives. End of story.
Yes.
Well, Oliver North's fingerprints are all over it.
I agree, and I agree with you that Ollie North's fingerprints are all over it. But what I'm telling you is that you're definitely, absolutely true. Yes, that's right. That's right. But it's not that it's a different C4 than and Stewart. Let's talk.
No, it's not. It's the same C4. You have a nice day, Miss Lindar.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you, caller. It's just different C4. It's not. This is where the caller is absolutely dead on the mark, correct? And I am very impressed, very, very impressed with his bona fides and his connections and direct contacts with those people.
Yeah. The interesting thing, Susan, the interesting thing about Ed Wilson was that Wilson had a direct connection through the CIA to Ahmed Jibril.
Yes, that's what I wanted to say.
There was a big connection.
Tell Ahmed Jibril is the founder of.
He started the PFLPGC, which was a breakaway group from George Abbas.
Yeah, it's this
Palestinian
long
Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Yeah.
General Command was the title. Now, Jibril gave an interview to one media.
So Ed Wilson, here's the thing that we're trying to say to the caller.
Yeah.
He's absolutely right about Ollie North.
Yeah.
But
the Iran-Contra gang.
Ed Wilson gave C4 to Gaddafi, but he also gave it to Ahmed Jibril at PFLPGC.
Yeah, and that's where the connection probably to Wilson comes around in this particular one. because Wilson, Jibril and Abu Nidal were both groups that were well known for attacking aircraft at the time. And there's a number of rumors in the Middle East about Nidal being involved in the Lockerbie situation. And
yes.
None of them have been sort of 100% brought out. But I know for a fact, and here's a good one for your listeners. They may not believe this, but it's true. The BCCI Bank was about to be closed down in 1992 by the Bank of England. A short time before that, Abu Nidal visited London, was given an armed police escort to go and collect his money out of the BCCI before they shut it down. You can read that in
Abu Nidal
Hansard.
was a wanted terrorist by this point.
A wanted terrorist at this time, yes. But what's interesting is you can read all about it in the record of the House of Commons, Hansard. And I found out about this from an MP who had done a lot of research on Lockerbie because his constituents had concerns about it. And he gave me, for a present, a copy of Hansard because they cover a number of years. And he put a little bookmark in, because there's hundreds of pages, of where he had asked a question of the Prime Minister, was it true that the Metropolitan Police had given an armed guard to a known terrorist to collect his money out of the BCCI Bank? And the answer came back in a one-word yes. Which you would not believe. And, you know,
because
you couldn't write that
because
script.
he was an asset.
Because he was an asset for MI6.
And he was, and they wanted him intelligent. They wanted he was no longer working in terrorism. He'd retired from the business, and so he was considered a new source that they could mine. Everybody, we're at the end of our show. Stewart Nicol, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much.
And I appreciate so much, and I apologize that I was interrupting you for so much of the show. But anytime I get on the subject of Lockerbie, you're going to have to come back on again, and you are an inspiring, provocative guest. And I want the family of Megrahi to have the justice.